busy talking for a minute. Didn't catch that. Did she read it like I wrote it?
I read it, Scott handed to me. Yes?
Hey, good crowd here tonight. Appreciate you coming. Doesn't anybody stay home and watch the Olympics? 17 years ago this month, February of 2005, I gave my first PowerPoint presentation of the Utah Idaho Central Railroad history to this not this group, but a Cache Valley History Society group in a different venue. Now I'm pleased to be able to be back and give my final presentation to this group because next Tuesday is the 75th anniversary of when the last UIC passenger train left Ogden for a round trip to Preston. That's a milestone. I can't believe 75 years have gone by since that time. But let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. First of all, the birth and death of the Utah Idaho Central Railroad, or as we referred to it as the UIC, electric trolley that ran through the middle of every town in Cache Valley, including Logan right out here in front of the courthouse. I'd like to preface that, though, with a short history of the Utah Northern Railroad, which was the first steam railroad into Cache Valley, and actually the first railroad. And the reason I do that is because there's some commonality between the two railroads as to where they came in the valley. And we'll touch on that. And then as we go along, I'll catch a few little historical events and trivia that I hope you'll be interested in. Now, let me give you a little bit more of my background that I didn't write down on there because I saved that for now. People ask me, well, how'd you get interested in the history of the UIC Railroad? And I tell them, well, I was born into it. My father worked for the UIC Railroad for 28 years. My Uncle Roy from Preston, over 30 years. I was born in 1930, and as I was growing up, 3, 4, 5 years old, my mother would take me and put me on the trolley out here in Logan and take me to Preston to visit my grandmother. And then in 1946, during the summer between my sophomore and junior years, I was 15 at the time, and my dad got me a job on the section gang of the UIC. His boss, Lonnie Paul, also got his son, Bud Paul, a job, and Bud and I were classmates. We had the chance to work during that summer, going out with the crew on a little cart like this one, similar to it, trying to learn how to be gandy dancers. A gandy dancer is nothing more than a railroad maintenance person. Sounds pretty fancy, doesn't it? But you know, if you have 2 young high school kids on your crew, anything can go wrong. Well, enough of my lifetime. I'd like to go in now and keep us all on the same page as we go through the presentation. I'd like to cover the term rail gauge. I'm sure many of you know what it is, but those that don't, it's a measurement between the inside of the rails. Now, a narrow gauge would be around 36 inches. And most of those have died out, except lately you see them in the mining industry or in entertainment. If you go to Disneyland and take the train around the loop of the Disneyland, that's a narrow gauge. Or you can go to Durango, Colorado, or the train that takes you up to Silverton, that's a narrow gauge. And the broad gauge could be anywhere bigger than that, longer than that, or wider than that, up to over 5 feet. The problem in 1800 was the fact that there were a lot of railroads back east, and a lot of them in California, and there was also a lot of different gauges. Makes it a little tough to drive a railroad train from one railroad onto another one if they don't have matching gauges. And that's one of the problems that plague the nation. You'd find something like this with a narrow gauge track installed right up the middle of a standard, national standard railroad gauge, 3 feet wide compared to, well, the national standard gauge we're going to talk about in just a minute. When Lincoln's administration wanted to build a railroad from the east across the nation to the Pacific Ocean, they passed the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 and established the Pacific Transcontinental Railroad Act. That established it, but the next year they passed the Railroad Act of 1863, which established the gauge. Lincoln didn't want to have Central Pacific and Union Pacific meet out here at Promontory, and one of them's 4 feet 8 inches across and the other's 5 feet. That would be a disaster. So it's going to be a national standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, and Lincoln signed both of those acts. Now 4 feet 8.5 inches, that sounds like a crazy measurement. And where it came from, you could talk for the next half hour. For example, they said, well, that's the same measurement between the tracks that were formed in the rocks by the Roman chariots hundreds of years ago. Or it's a measurement between the rear ends of a pair of horses that pull in a wagon. I feel that a man by the name of George Stephenson had influence on the Lincoln administration. He was in charge of mines, the tramways, and he used 4 feet 8 inches. In 1825, he was in charge of building one railroad and then subsequently another railroad. Both times he used 4 feet 8 inches, but they say he added a ½ inch to allow a little bit of wiggle room, if you will, around the curves. Britain, of course, was furnishing locomotives to America, and a lot of them arriving with a 4 feet 8 inch undercarriage. I don't know for sure if I'm right in assuming that's where he was influenced, but whatever, this was set to be the national standard, and the railroads from there on had to comply to that standard. Boy, I like that sound. And that's the only sound effect you're going to get tonight, but it sets the stage of us going into the steam railroad. Most of you know what this picture's all about. The driving of the Golden Spike out at Promontory, May 10th, 1869. 2 years later, a little over 2 years, a group of men got together in Logan to form a railroad board sanctioned by Brigham Young. And of course, his son, John W., was selected as the president and superintendent of that board. They also selected 2 men from back east to be kind of the financial arm of the railroad that was going to be established. And they were the ones that were supposed to furnish the rails and the rolling stock. Well, the railroad was supposed to go from Ogden to Soda Springs by way of Cache Valley. It was to be a narrow gauge system with small steam engines. It was also supposed to be a people's railroad, in that the people along the way, and this was Mormon backed with Brigham Young, of course, backing it up, but the wards and groups along the route were allotted certain miles for them to prepare the roadbed, obtain logs to make the ties, and then help to lay the rails. In return, they were given railroad vouchers to show that they had a little part of the railroad. Some of them were paid cash, particularly those that had a good team of horses and the implements that would help to move the work along more rapidly. So by July of 1872, 23 miles of track had been laid between Brigham City and Hampton Station, which is on the edge of Cache Valley. They had 2 round trips a day from trains. Now they had to decide, well, how are we going to get into Cache Valley? Well, their surveyor, James Martineau, recommended they go through Bear River Canyon. But he was overpowered by the board, who said, probably they thought, that's going to cost too much money. It's going to take too long. So I think we're going to build up the incline, and we're going to go over a divide that's called Collinston Pass. You're going to hear that name several times tonight. So that's the way they went. They took the road up over Collinston Pass and down to Mendon, and the first railroad or first train struggled to get over Collinston Pass, but finally made it and got into Mendon December 22nd, 1872. The name of that first one was the John W., which was named after John W. Young. This is not the John W., but it's similar to that train. Now they took the rails right straight across the valley to Logan, and they arrived there around the end of January of 1873. Wellsville and Hiram were bypassed. Now with the right-of-way intact, they decided to go north around September of 1873, and they made it up to Franklin on May of 1874, and there they became stalled. Their financial backing from back east dried up because they were tied up with the panic of 1873 that was kind of an economic depression, and they weren't about to put any more money into the railroad. Well, at Franklin, there was 14 miles of roadway prepared beyond Franklin. They just didn't have the materials to continue to build it. Well, after 3.5 years, some financial finagling and negotiations took place with a man by the name of Jay Gould, who was connected with the Union Pacific in the middle of it all. He and a few others kind of worked things around to where on April 3rd, 1878, there was a reorganization at Franklin, and the Union Pacific took over. The Utah Northern then became the Utah and Northern Railroad under the auspices of the Union Pacific. Well, with the Union Pacific in charge at Franklin, they had heard that there was silver and copper being mined up in Montana. They wanted to get there as quick as possible. They didn't feel like the road through Soda Springs was the way to go, so they abandoned that. They received the right-of-way to go in a different direction. So they took off to the northwest out of Cache Valley, went past Preston, and Preston at that time was called Worm Creek. But with the railroad going through, it was bound to grow. They went on to Downey in eastern Idaho and up to western Montana, arriving in Butte, Montana in 1881, and then from there finally at Garrison, Montana in 1884. At that time, there were 466 miles from Ogden, considered the longest narrow gauge in the world. And the thing I didn't mention was that the Utah Northern, when it arrived in Franklin, it became the first railroad in the Idaho Territory. Well, the Union Pacific had their work cut out for them. They wanted to haul stuff out of Montana to other parts of the country. In order to do so, they had to change from a narrow gauge to the national standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. Between 1885 and 1887, that was pretty well underway. So we returned back to square one in Cache Valley area. The Union Pacific said at this time it was Utah Northern, would not abandon the Collinson Pass and line to Brigham City until a new line had been built with the standard gauge width into Cache Valley. So that's what they began to do. They made a new line from Brigham City with a standard gauge on up, and they decided to take what Surveyor Martineau suggested they do by going through Bear River Canyon. This picture from the USU archives shows that difficult chore being taken care of. Well, after that was completed, the roads came over Bear River Canyon and went south to Mendon. Right up where the yellow arrow is pointing, they created a junction or built a junction and took the railroad north on the western side of Cache Valley through or near the little towns of Trenton, Cornish, Weston, Dayton, and on to Downey. That junction had the obvious name of Cache Junction. Now, Cache Junction was established in 1890, and for the next couple decades, it grew into a pretty viable little community. It had a hotel, a bank, a couple of eating houses. The Cache Junction Cafe was nicknamed the Beanery. I think there's probably a few here today that went out there to have a steak or shrimp, because the Beanery didn't close until February of 1986, after the railroad passenger traffic ceased in Cache Junction and the town started to dwindle. Another piece of trivia on Cache Junction: the Aggies played Montana State and Montana University a number of times during the first three or four decades of the 1900s. When they played in Montana, they would bus them out to Cache Junction and load them up on the train to go to and from Montana. Okay, time to get off the steam road and get on to the UIC electric trolley. Now, if you were born before or around 1944, you would have been old enough to see those trains traveling down the main street of the towns in Cache Valley. But the story begins in Ogden. Have any of you ever heard of the Eccles? The David Eccles Corporation incorporated the Ogden Rapid Transit Railroad in 1900. They took over the Ogden Electric Railroad that had trouble trying to survive as the intercity transportation of Ogden. Through 1900 to 1909, the Ogden Rapid Transit became a very viable, money-making interurban electric rail machine. So much for that they decided to do the same thing in Logan. So they came to Logan, established or incorporated the Logan Rapid Transit for about $500,000 in capital, meaning about $14.5 million in today's money. They began with the celebration down on 6th West and Center by the depot, ceremoniously broke ground with a plow and started to build the railroad up the middle of Center Street till they got to Main Street. As we get to Main Street, we take a look on the southwest corner of the center of the intersection. There's a beautiful building called the Thatcher Bank and Opera House. It was built in 1890, and the bank took up the corner and a lot of the east side, which would be the left side of the photograph. A couple other businesses occupied space in the ground floor. The second and third stories had this beautiful opera house, 800-seat capacity. I wish they'd had color film to take a picture because of the descriptions you read in the history. It was fabulous. This was called the Jewel of Cache Valley in northern Utah, one of the first buildings that could be lit by electricity. They had troops coming from downstate, Ogden, Salt Lake, as well as local, and from out of state to perform operas, vaudevilles, musicals, plays, boxing matches, and they even had dances there. It really wasn't much of a money-making for the Thatchers, but they enjoyed having that venue available for the local people to come. Okay, meanwhile, out on the intersection in front of the bank, they turned the railroad north down Center Street, or down Main Street, and turned up 4th North, and went until they got up to 6th East and turned left on 6th East over to 5th North. When that was finally complete, they began to run or carry students up and back to Utah Agriculture College, as well as a lot of town people taking a ride into the good shopping part of Logan and Main Street. After they operated for about a year or so, and around 1911, they decided they wanted to expand. They thought about going north on 60th and go south from Center and Main. Well, let's look at the Center and Main first. They went down the Main Street across Logan River, angled up, and terminated at Providence City. On the north end, they went north from 6th East, angled on up to 8th East, about around 10th North, maybe between 9th and 10th, and ran the road out 8th East. Now at that time, we'd be out in a territory we call North Logan, but at that time it was called Greenville. North Logan was not incorporated until around 1934. At this time, I had a couple guys about 10, 15 years ago made a dispute about the railroad going out on 8th East. I didn't have any way to prove it except what was written in the history, until Don Yonkers furnished me with this photograph of his family farm about 2400 North on 8th East, and there in the foreground is the railroad track on the west side of 8th East. We're in 1912 now, and the Hyde Park Town Board in March granted a franchise to the Logan Rapid Transit to construct an electric railroad through their town. And this was proposed that they angle down from 8th East and go along 1st West in Hyde Park. There was about 4 dozen Hyde Park men that had the opportunity to work on the railroad, and that was an economic boon to the little community of Hyde Park. They began work on that the last part of March, and as they got to the middle of April, around April 17th, disaster struck in Logan. The Thatcher Bank and Opera House was on fire. They felt that it started in the basement of an adjacent store called the Golden Rule store. The Golden Rule was the forerunner to J.C. Penney. It started in the basement, and they tried to put it out and couldn't. And by the time they got the fire wagons over there, it was just out of control. They had to just kind of let it burn as the roof caved in, and so did the other floors. This is a good photograph, though, to point out the entrance that went to the stairway that led up to the Opera House. And the description of that being carpeted stairway, it must have been a fabulous place. Well, finally, it burned down completely except a few walls. And the night before, on the 16th, the Utah Agricultural College Opera Company performed the Mikado. They had the dubious honor of making the last performance in the Thatcher Opera House. Now you look at that and say, well, I think that the Agriculture College Opera Company was supposed to also perform on the 17th, on the evening. If that was the case, and the fire had started 4 or 5 hours later, the Opera House would have been full of people, and that would have been a disaster. As it was, the Logan Republican headlines blared out, greatest fire in the history of Cache Valley. Thatcher Bank building and Opera House completely wiped out at a cost of about $125,000, interpolated to $3.5 million loss in today's dollar value. Look at the companion story on the right-hand side. Titanic sinks beneath the waves. That happened a couple days before during the nighttime. And right under that story, it talks about the UIC performance of the Mikado. I think that newspaper felt that was a pretty big news day. Well, meanwhile, back at the railroad, we completed through Hyde Park, and they had a celebration there with about 500 people attending in the old Rock Church. But the railroad was continued to build. They went down from Hyde Park to the highway and right up the middle of Main Street in Smithfield. Then, at this time, the Logan Rapid Transit was now nearly 12 miles long with 2 branches, the Logan Intercity and Smithfield to Providence. Well, later in that year, December, David Eccles passed away, and his son, Mariner S. Eccles, took over. And that's a big job because the Eccles had a lot of enterprises to look over. After 4 years of operation to the end of 1913, very profitable, the Eccles Corporation was paying 8% dividends to the stockholders. I'd like a piece of that action. Difficult to get 1% today. Well, the upgrading of the track took place about the middle of the 1910s. These pictures didn't have dates on them. We're just kind of making a guess. But now in the background, you see the building that rose out of the ashes of the burned down Thatcher Bank and Opera House. Come along quite well at this time with the inside yet to be done. Now, what was happening here, as I understand from stories that my dad told me years ago, that when they laid the original ties and track down on the dirt and gravel base, after the trains had run on them for a while, there were soft spots that makes the train a little bit looking like a drunken sailor going down Main Street. So what they were doing here, they were dug it all up and they were laying a concrete foundation and then putting the ties on top. And to this part in the curve, they have the ties already down. The rails that were laid down Main Street at that time are the same rails that they pulled up 2 or 3 years ago when they renovated Center Street. Now we move a little bit further down, taken almost the same day, in front of the tabernacle. You can see the cement crew feverishly working to lay down the concrete to finish that chore. And at this time, we have heavy equipment working towards Preston to finally finish the roadway up there. So when they did, they finally began to build from Smithfield on up to Richmond, through Richmond's Main Street, down to Lewiston and into the south part of Preston. On the south side, they were building from Providence to Millville, and then angled down to Hiram. Whoops. Now, if we look at this late Google map, at the top we see the road that goes to Hiram and Mountain Crest High School. Also, right up in the left-hand corner, you see that road that angles down. If it were to go straight, it would meet this road that angles into Hiram. Takes a shortcut into Hiram. That was all the original railroad bed years ago. And when the rails were taken up, they made roads out of them. Went down first north in Hiram to Center Street, where the station was located. Okay, as we finish our track from Hiram to Wellsville around the latter part of 1914, we find that we've got now trackage going all the way from Preston to Wellsville. That made it pretty easy for people to get around the valley from one end to the other and getting into Logan to shop. But there was something else that took place in 1914. They consolidated the schools in both the north end, established in the North Cache High School, opened September 1914. The same thing in the south, as they opened up South Cache High School in September 1914. This gave the high school kids transportation to get to school, hook a ride to the trolley, riding back and forth. During the next 15 years, hundreds, if not thousands, of high school kids and college kids rode on the trolley to get to school. At this time, in 1914, the Ogden Rapid Transit and the Logan Rapid Transit merged to form the Ogden-Logan Idaho Railroad Company. They wanted to get connected physically. They wasn't sure how they would come into Cache Valley. They considered going up from Ogden Canyon into Huntsville and coming north down through Paradise, which was the shortest route. They also considered going up Brigham through Manaway over Sardine Summit and down Wellsville Canyon. That was the next longest, but that's a heck of a climb for a railroad. But they finally decided the other thing was just to go north from Brigham City to Collinston over the pass into Cache Valley And you can guess what the reasons would be. First of all, they could use the Union Pacific's abandoned narrow gauge roadbed. Secondly, they could furnish service to small towns like Deweyville, Honeyville, and Tremont. So that's the way they went. They determined that Brigham City would be the meeting point of building from Ogden to Brigham and from Wellsville on. From Wellsville up to Mandan, it was a pretty tough go. Once they got on the old narrow gauge road, though, it was much easier to widen that and make it the standard gauge. They met in Brigham, and now we had rail service all the way from Preston to Ogden. And it gave a lot of people some options about leaving the valley. You notice up there a Quinney branch operated by the Cache Valley Railway Company. Well, the Quinney branch was also an Eccles Corporation. It was primarily for freight, hauling sugar beets into Lewiston Sugar Factory or Sugarton, wherever it was located. And they also put 2 passenger trains out on that branch to pick up the kids from that western part of the valley to take them into North Cache to school at a no-charge type situation. Well, here we see a train, an UIC train, going up the incline to the Collinston Pass. If we look out into the background, we see what looks like a texture of a railroad track. And if so, that's the Union Pacific tracks that they laid down before they abandoned the narrow gauge road earlier. Now, we actually have had in the past people mistakenly call the UIC the Bamberger. I don't know if any of you have heard that happen. In fact, I read an article in the newspaper around 2008 where the author referred to it as the old Bamberger. I had a woman come up and tell me that her mother told her that she used to catch the Bamberger in Smithfield and go all the way to Salt Lake. I said, well, you're half right. The Bamberger only went as far north as Ogden. Let me tell you a quick story of the Bamberger and how it related to the UIC. The Bamberger, Simon Bamberger, decided he wanted to compete with the Union Pacific and Denver and Rio Grande railroads. So he began to build a railroad from Ogden towards, or from Salt Lake towards Ogden. In 1895, he reached Farmington. There was nothing but a bunch of swampland. But he drained that swamp, made an artificial lake, and then made the finest amusement park in the West, named Lagoon. And finally, he reached Ogden around 31st Street in 1908, and then further into Ogden later. From 1910, he switched over to electric trains, which made it pretty handy when he started to work with the UIC. Now, if you wanted to go to Salt Lake, not a big deal, because when you got to Ogden, the UIC train and the Bamberger were side by side. All you had to do was get off of one and get on the other to get on to Salt Lake. Now we go back to Logan, and the rail yard occupied the block where Blah Motel is currently located, between 1st and 2nd South, Main Street and 1st West. Notice down in the right-hand corner, we have a blue square. That's the UIC station on the corner of 1st South and Main. That building still exists there, however. Up in the left-hand corner, the Union Pacific had a branch that came up 3rd South, turned over 1st West, and in front of Pacific Fruit Company. They would bring boxcar loads of fruit from California and park them in front of the Pacific Fruit Company. They in turn would then load them and distribute them out to the various grocery stores around the valley. I remember working in a grocery store a long time ago and have Pacific Fruit bring stuff to their grocery store. That little red square in the middle represents the garage that we parked our little gas cart that we went to work with. When we arrived out to work at 5 o'clock in the morning, we would go check the empty boxcars and go through the straw, hoping that maybe they forgot a watermelon. Once in a while we did. A couple times we'd take it and go over and put it in a nearby canal to cool off. And then when we come back from work around a hot afternoon at 2 o'clock, we'd go over and get the watermelon out of the canal and have a cool refreshment. The squares on the east represent the Brigham Young College that functioned until 1926. Logan High took over that campus in 1927. A little piece of trivia information. As we look at this picture, I've heard various descriptions of it, and I don't know which ones is true. But as I look at it, I date it around 1917. World War I had been going for a couple of years before America got involved in it in 1917. I think I would read this picture as a platoon of recruits as part of a larger contingent that was stretched down the street on a rainy afternoon waiting for the UIC to bring some trains along for them to load up onto to take him into Ogden and transfer to the Bamberger, who would take him to Salt Lake and eventually end up at Fort Douglas and then be shipped over during the war. Well, we move into January 1918, and finally the Ogden, Logan, and Idaho Railway Company name was changed to the Utah Idaho Central Railroad, UIC. The name it kept for the rest of its time. The Little Cache Valley Railroad was also included. That's the one that was on Quinny Branch. Also in 1918, a few things happened. World War I came to an end with the armistice signed in November 11th. I bring that out because after people got back from serving in World War I, they wanted to buy cars. Everybody wants their wheels. And other goods became available. And that started to cut in the passenger service of the UIC. Just a way as trivia, 1918 to 1920, the Spanish flu pandemic that killed 50 million worldwide, 675,000 Americans. It kind of fits you in with today. The historian Ira Sweat stated that the first UIC timetable showed that 16 trains per day each way between Ogden and Preston. That would put a lot of trains going up and down the main streets of the towns in the valley. This is not the first timetable, but it's a sample of one with about 12 trains. Now you can't see the detail on there, but they put these schedules out for a purpose. It tells the people on a certain train where they are supposed to be and what time they were supposed to be there. The trains on the right-hand side were the northbound trains, and they were supposed to give way to the southbound trains, which means that the northbound trains had to make sure that they were on a siding someplace so the southbound train could wheel on through. Well, that put a lot of weight onto these well-dressed trainmen and their trusty railroad watches. They had to keep it synchronized throughout the whole system to make sure that they knew where they were and where they should be at a certain time. If not, something like this would happen, where a passenger train telescoped a wooden switching engine caused by a dispatcher error. Well, they had heavy snows that also tied up the traffic, but they had some pretty good plows to take care of that. This one pushed by a freight train motor. This one pushed by a passenger motor. It looks kind of like a homemade affair, but it was effective. But the rail yards was manual labor to shovel it out. Well, in the early 20s, the rail passenger numbers declined. The UIC began a bus service between Ogden and Preston to go by way of Sardine Canyon to Brigham City. It would save about 16 miles and save 20 to 25 minutes. But what it also did, it took passengers away from their own rail service. If you look at the map at the south part of Cache Valley, the road that you take to Brigham City now is the one on the left. You travel that over Sardine Summit. That road didn't exist at this time. The trains, or the buses, actually went through Mount Sterling and traveled through the old Sardine Canyon Road and then through the summit. And that was a treacherous road. I remember going over the old Sardine Canyon when I was 5 years old, my dad driving the bus over there, and that scared me to death. As you go today through the dry lake, you see the old Sardine Canyon Road still up on the side of the mountain. It's been closed off. And then Sardine Summit, of course, is up where the road sheds are. Then they decided to put buses on the inner city. This is the early buses. My dad decided to change from being an engineer on the train to chauffeuring the bus. And that's him on the left with the Chev bus. You can see in the front saying depot to college. And the one on the right, the old Mac, George Detweiler, or uncle to Denzel Detweiler, if any of you know him. This picture was given to me by the Logan Transit District. And you see on the side of it, it says Utah Idaho Central Railroad inscription with their logo on the lower part. Well, with the bus service being put in, that means that the tracks are going to be changed. The bus could take it from the depot on up, and instead of going on 6th East, it had the ability to go up highway into the campus and make a circle. This is an early picture of the campus, and on the hour, 9, 10, 11, it followed the arrows and made stops at the library and all the corners and the Bluebird Cafe before going down the steep incline off from the Bluebird Cafe, back on 7th East to 4th North. On the half hour, up in the left-hand corner, it went down past Romney Stadium, made a right-hand turn on 8th East, went down to 9th North, and a left-hand turn down to 5th East, and then back over to 4th North and back to the depot. So with the change, that meant that they would extend the tracks from 4th North and Main out to about 9th North and angle them up towards Greenville. It also meant that the tracks from 1st West to 6th West were discontinued, and sometime after that they planted grass in those center spots. And that also meant that the 400 North track was discontinued, along with the 800 East track to Hyde Park. You see here a freight train just angling off around 9th North, heading up to Greenville and Hyde Park. As we look at a BLM map 5 years later, you could still see the roadbed going right up through there. As we move a little bit further north to Hyde Park with that same BLM map, we see the abandoned roadbed up above. You see 3 squares in the middle. The middle one is the house that belongs to Lennis and me. When we built that house in 2008, I started to pick up spikes. And then I picked up tie plate and a piece of rail. I said, wait a minute, what's going on? It's been quite a few years since I'd been out there on the section gang, and I had no idea. But then I looked closer on that map, and you can see the roadbed went right through our house and on past Hyde Park. Some people had a panoramic photograph on their walls that was taken off of a building on the southeast corner of Center and Main. A couple interesting things that I'd like to show you. They let me photograph it, and I broke it into thirds and only look at 2 of them. At the far left, you see the UIC station on First South with a freight train parked in front of it. Further on down, you see the entrance to the Capitol Theater, which is now the Eccles Theater, which opened in 1923. It was built by George and Guy Thatcher, the same ones that lost by fire the Opera House. You see also a safety water tank, and if in fact the Thatchers built that water tank, it was because they were a little bit paranoid about not having water available. Well, this is 11 years after the fire that they finally built the Capitol. They had a bigger venue to where they could have a lot of operas and stuff take place. But they were also showing movies at this time. A lot of them were showing movies. And the problem was that the movie film was made with cellulose nitrate base, highly inflammable, almost explosive. And that would be another reason to make sure you had a good water supply, but it's hard to put it out with water because when it burns, it creates its own oxygen. You can put it in a bucket of water, it'll still burn. There was a lot of fires across the nation at projection booths, and there were a lot of projectionists that died in the fires. Well, enough of that. We go to the middle picture, Center Street in Maine. You see a trolley car ready to go onto Main Street. You take a long look down the right-hand side of Main Street, you see an abundance of automobiles. And you know that that was cutting in to the passenger traffic of the train. Up on top of this building that was finally finished after the fire, and it's been finished about over 11 years ago. You see the Thatcher Bank sign on the top, at the bottom the Thatcher Bank, but the upper floors made up the Eccles Hotel. Entrance right down there. Well, we're at the end of 1929, and you know what happened at the end of 1929. Stock market crash, a Great Depression globally. By 1932, the stocks were still only worth 20%. 1933, half the banks had failed. 30% of the workforce was unemployed. And the effects of the Depression lasted almost the entire 1930s. But during the 1930s, the Depression, the UIC trains and intercity bus service continued to operate, and we were glad that my dad still had a job and was putting food on the table. Revenue from the passengers mail service accounted for only 18% or less of the UIC income. The freight train traffic made up the rest, and that wasn't very much. Looking down at the freight trains that goes through, a lot of them were pretty much about 2 feet or 2 blocks long. If you were a passenger in a car wanting to get across Main Street, east to west or west to east, when these mammoth freight trains came along at 8-10 miles an hour, you better have your lunch with you, because you'd get caught up in this type of a situation. Well, in 1946, after World War II had ended, there were more cars on the road, and it made it unsafe for people to get off the trains and on the trains and make it back and forth through traffic to the station. Over a 3-year period, competition from several sources drastically cut into the UIC freight business and the number of passengers. So during that time, the number of trains dropped down to 1 per day round trip compared to 16 at its height. So they were operating in the red between 43 and 46 to the tune of over $337,000, which would be close to 3.4 million today's dollar. December 20th, they made an application to abandon the rail line. February 13th, 1947, Judge Tillman Johnson issued orders suspending the passenger operation effective 1 minute after midnight on February 16th, 1947. So on the 15th, 1947, the last passenger train, UIC, left Ogden at 9:30, came through Logan, made a stop, went to Preston, picked up an extra car, came cruising back through Hyde Park, stopped in Logan and picked up 40 more passengers approximately. And when they got back to Ogden, 8:20 that night, there were only about 4 or 5 passengers left. But the rest of them had the experience of riding the last train that existed. The freight trains were supposed to cease on February 28th, 1947. So the next 2 weeks they had a busy time trying to replenish the many coal yards that were spotted along Main Street in Logan and the various towns. And the last train to make a trip on the yard was the line car to do an inspection. Well, today, the sagebrush grows on Collinson Pass, where both the Utah Northern and the Utah Idaho Central Railroads first entered and exited Cache Valley, even though it was 40 years apart. You might even see a tie in the ground as evidence of what used to be a railroad 75 years ago. But what else evidence remains today that the UIC Railroad ever existed in Cache Valley? Well, in about 5 minutes. Let's see, in Preston, all the stations except one were built with a projected window with windows on the side where they could look up and down the track to see if the trains were coming. At Preston, it was taken over by a car dealership and the characteristic of the station completely obliterated. In Lewiston, it was contained and became a private home. In Richmond, it's the same way as it was. It's been a lot of businesses in there. The last one was a salon, and they recently moved out. As we moved to Smithfield, the Cache Valley Bank occupies the building now. They took over from Wells Fargo. We moved into Logan. Logan was the only one that didn't have the projected window. They had the overhanging awning, sturdy one. There've been a lot of people, a lot of changeover of businesses in the building since that time. This is how it looks today. As we moved to Hiram, thanks to Darren and his kindness, gave me the picture on the top of how it was in Hiram at that time and how it is today on the lower picture. And I'm told by Dominion Gas that it's a triplex. Moved on to Wellsville. As I first looked at that building and I saw dormers, I said, wait a minute. But then I started to look at the placement of the doors and windows compared to that far left side of the upper picture, and they pretty well matched. So driving around the other side, there it is, the projected window. I knew that that was the old station. We moved to the last one, Mendon Station. A lot of businesses tried to make a go out of it. Lately, it was renovated into a community center with a big place built on the back side. So we still have almost all 7 of the 8 stations are still intact as they were. So the UIC finally came to a finish. RIP UIC 1910-1947. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. This was awesome. This is our largest crowd since COVID. So thank you all for coming out and braving this and learning about this fascinating history. There were some great photos in there. And I learned a lot about not just the railroads that came into town, UICC, and you had some great stories just about downtown Logan and all of these small town stations and communities. So that was a great aspect. So thank you, Ted.